in the arid landscapes of New Mexico, where the sun scorched the earth by day and the clear, cold night revealed a tapestry of stars, there dwelled secrets best left buried. In a modest, unremarkable town on the edge of the desert, the ordinary rhythm of daily life continued uninterrupted. The low hum of pickup trucks on dusty roads, quiet conversations in roadside diners, and the slow passage of days marked by the relentless glare of a blazing sky. Yet far away from the public eye, within a windowless trailer on a forgotten stretch of highway, a darkness was taking shape. A darkness that would come to be whispered about in hushed tones as the work of the toy box killer. It began in the early 1970s, when the vast New Mexico landscape seemed to hold both boundless promise and an enduring isolation. The townsfolk spoke of missing persons with a furtive glance and a shudder, as if the arid wind carried with it grim secrets too horrifying to repeat. In that barren expanse, tragedy did not come with grand announcements. It crept in, silently, unnoticed, a predator concealed within the everyday monotony of life. David Parker grew up amid the stark contradictions of the desert. As a boy, he was quiet and observant, a child whose eyes absorbed every detail of a world both beautiful and unyielding. In a nearby town, children played beneath the skeletal branches of mesquite trees and powdered the streets with dreams and dust. But behind his withdrawn demeanor, David harbored a fascination with mechanisms, with the intricacies of how things were built and sometimes how they could be broken. By his early 20s, David Parker had learned to hide in plain sight. He took jobs that suited his unsociable nature, slipping from one transient role to the next, never forming lasting bonds. Neighbors recalled a man who kept to himself, always polite yet distant, a puzzle that no one could solve. Even as he traversed the dusty highways of New Mexico, his mind wandered to thoughts that bordered on the macabre. In the seclusion of a worn workbench in a back room of a trailer, he assembled small contraptions, carefully preserving the meticulous order of his personal domain. It was during these years that whispers began to surface. Rumors of a toy box filled not with simple trinkets, but with objects of unspeakable design, pieces of machinery, bizarre modifications to everyday tools, and even sketches of scenes that no ordinary mind would conjure began to circulate in underground circles. No one knew the full extent of his private world, but soon David Parker's name became synonymous with an enigma, a man whose inward darkness took tangible shape. By the mid-1970s, David had claimed a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of a small New Mexico town as his sanctuary. To an unobservant passerby, the trailer was little more than a neglected relic, its peeling paint and rusted hinges blending into the bleak surroundings. Inside, the trailer was an eerie contrast to the scorched desert outside. Dim, flickering light revealed a space both cramped and chaotic. A living area cluttered with outdated furniture, layers of dust covering forgotten memories, and a back room partitioned off by heavy, rusted doors. Behind those doors lay David's secret workshop, a room filled with carefully arranged implements, tools that had been refashioned into objects of a cruel purpose, and an array of makeshift devices that hinted at a meticulous modus operandi. The air was thick with the metallic tang of oil and rust, a scent that would later be remembered as the odor of unutterable acts. David maintained a strict schedule in this isolated existence. Mornings were spent in solitude, with long hours dedicated to repairing or repurposing tools, his focused gaze betraying an inner intensity. He brewed his own coffee on an old camp stove, savoring the bitter aroma as he planned his day's work in silent calculation. It was during these quiet rituals that he would glance through a small, scratched mirror, a brief, unreflective look at the man hidden behind the facade of routine. In those moments, David Parker's thoughts drifted to the dark fantasies that plagued his mind, a private gallery of suffering, crafted with the precision of a deranged artist. New Mexico's vast emptiness was not just a backdrop. It was a stage upon which despair and desolation played out nightly. In local bars and roadside diners, those who were struggling to find connection were drawn together by isolation. It was in these places that David began to hunt, a predator seeking not only victims but also, perhaps, a twisted kind of companionship forged in shared vulnerability. The desperate, the lonely, and the lost became his unwitting muses. One man, Michael Mick Alvarez, was a typical patron of a run-down diner near the highway. In his mid-20s, Mick had dreams of leaving the small town behind, of finding a better life in a larger city. He worked long hours at a service station, spending his scant free moments at the diner, where the gruff voice of the cook and the soft hum of the jukebox provided solace from his routine. Mick was known for his quiet optimism, a glimmer of hope that unfortunately made him an irresistible target for someone who equated vulnerability with opportunity. On an otherwise unremarkable autumn night, as the desert wind whispered secrets through barren fields, Mick left the diner after a late shift. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, his steps unhurried as he meandered along a lonely stretch of road, his thoughts drifting from the promise of a new day to the weight of an unfulfilled future. It was on this stretch that fate, guided by the calculated indifference of David Parker, would entwine their lives. Mick's fate was sealed when a polite, seemingly friendly man offered him a lift, speaking in a low, soothing tone that masked a far more sinister intent. While Mick's story was one that might have ended as many mundane tragedies do, a life unremarked, a soul lost to fate. The encounter that fateful night was merely the first of many in a dark series of events. In the days following, Mick's family recalled his routine with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. Each morning, before the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, he would slip on his worn boots, share a few words with his mother as she prepared breakfast, and set off in his beat-up pickup truck to the service station. His gentle nature and quiet smile had endeared him to those who knew him, making his subsequent disappearance all the more jarring. Back at the trailer, David Parker meticulously planned the unfolding of his cruel agenda. The toy box room became his stage, a place where he transformed the narratives of vulnerable lives into orchestrated acts of terror. In carefully measured sessions, He would examine each victim under the lens of his deranged philosophy, cataloging every detail in a battered leather journal. In these entries, he wrote in clinical language about his perceived mastery over fate and the beauty he found in the suffering of those who trusted him. To him, each life was a canvas upon which he could paint his dark dreams. It wasn't long before other desperate souls found themselves ensnared in his web. Thomas Reed, an aspiring musician with a gentle spirit and a tired smile, had grown up in a small town with big dreams, spending evenings strumming a battered guitar beneath the open sky, hoping that the magic of music would someday carry him away from poverty. An invitation to a party that promised a taste of the city's burgeoning nightlife ultimately brought Thomas into contact with David Parker. Under the pretense of opportunity and friendship, Thomas was lured into the shadows, his hopeful eyes betraying no inkling of the nightmare lurking ahead. In another corner of New Mexico's sprawling emptiness, a young woman named Samantha Sam Collins, a waitress with aspirations of becoming a writer, lived a life filled with quiet determination despite the hardships of her daily grind. Sam's existence was marked by small rituals of routine: early morning shifts at a diner, long walks down sun-baked streets as she scribbled her thoughts in a tattered journal, and evenings spent dreaming of far-off places where hope and possibility reigned supreme. A chance encounter with David Parker, who appeared unassuming yet oddly compelling, drew her into a conversation that would alter her trajectory. Though she initially felt a spark of kinship in the man's measured words, that connection soon dissolved into a haze of terror and regret, as the true nature of his intentions became horrifyingly clear. In the secret confines of his trailer, David Parker's workshop transformed from an inert room into a theater of fear. Here, the toy box, a nickname born from both the assortment of tools and the twisted devices he assembled, became emblematic of his reign over life and suffering. Muffled sounds, inaudible to outsiders, resonated in the dead of night as he enacted his grim experiments. The meticulously organized chaos of the room bore the marks of an individual who was both inventive and unfathomably cruel. Strange contraptions, assembled from repurposed parts and ordinary items transformed by his hands, lined the walls. Many of these devices were engineered to instill torment in ways that defied common understanding. It was during one long, oppressive night in late winter that David Parker's operation reached a disturbing crescendo. His journal entries from that period reveal a man at the zenith of his cruelty, a cold, calculated orchestrator of suffering who recorded every nuance of his victim's fear. Yet even as he committed these acts, in the quiet recesses of that hidden space, David's mind wandered to abstract musings, a morbid celebration of life's fragility and a perverse fixation on the idea that in darkness, true power was born. For those who vanished on dark roads and in silent nights, the communities they left behind became haunted by uncertainty. Mick Alvarez's family, unable to comprehend the sudden disappearance of a son who was the epitome of quiet hope, began a desperate search. Neighbors exchanged anxious glances and whispered speculations over cups of bitter coffee in the early mornings. The local sheriff's office, already stretched thin, struggled to reconcile the mounting list of missing persons with the cold indifference of an uncaring desert. In a small, cramped room above the service station, a police officer named Frank Mendez pored over case files late into the night. Mendez, a man whose weathered face bore years of quiet determination, had seen many disappearances over his long career. Yet something about these cases, so many lives lost in vague nocturnal circumstances, gnawed at him with a relentless persistence. In the dim light of a single desk lamp, he read witness statements, re-examined footprints in the dust, and scrutinized grainy photographs. Though he remained professional, a creeping dread began to take hold. The sense that an unseen hand had been reaching out from the darkness and snatching away fragile lives. Across town, Sam Collins found herself grappling with memory and guilt. Though she had narrowly escaped the clutches of David Parker on that fateful day, her nights were haunted by dreams of a harsh, mechanical whisper and dim, indistinct faces. In the solitude of her modest apartment, she would revisit her journal entries, aching to reclaim the hope that once filled her words. The vivid recollections of a man whose smile had belied monstrous intentions remained like shards in her memory, a reminder that even the most ordinary moments could mask unspeakable horror. By the early 1980s, the strings of fate began to tighten around an elusive culprit. Rumors circulated in local saloons and gas stations about a mysterious man seen lurking near deserted highways, in unlit parking lots, or stepping from the shadows of dilapidated trailers. Law enforcement, emboldened by mounting pressure from distraught families, began piecing together the troubling puzzle. Detectives discovered subtle connections between the victims, a pattern that, while veiled in ambiguity, whispered of predation under the cover of darkness. A breakthrough came when a battered notebook was recovered from an abandoned building, one that detailed bizarre apparatuses and cryptic sketches, unmistakably resonant with the design of the toy box. For Officer Mendez and his colleagues, the journal was both a chilling manifesto and a roadmap into a labyrinthine evil that they struggled to comprehend. With painstaking effort, they traced fragments of clues to long-overlooked intersections of missing persons cases, gradually narrowing down the suspect pool. All the while, the desert wind carried murmurs of a killer whose inventive, horrifying methods defied explanation. The investigation was not without its setbacks. Evidence was scarce, and the passage of time had blurred crucial details. Yet even amid uncertainty, the determination of those who refused to let the voices of the vanished be forgotten prevailed. In whispered debates in back rooms and over stacks of case files, the investigators pieced together a tapestry of life and loss, the quiet routine of everyday lives marred by the brutal hand of fate. As the net of suspicion began to close in, David Parker's days in his isolated trailer took on an increasing air of despair. The once meticulously maintained routine became frayed at the edges. The tools, once neatly arranged on dusty shelves, now lay scattered as if in chaotic defiance of order. With mounting pressure from investigations and the slow, creeping realization that he might one day be unmasked, David's journal entries grew erratic and cryptic, scribbled lines that hinted at inner conflict, even as the darkness within him remained intact. In his final entries, the tone shifted dramatically, a desperate clarity intermingled with an acceptance of the inevitable. A few nights before the investigation would finally break open, David wrote of a profound loneliness that had driven him to create a world of his own, where he alone determined who was worthy of existence and who would vanish into the silence of the desert night. Those entries would later serve as grim testimony to the depth of his depravity, and, for many, a haunting reminder of how even the most mundane existence could hide unimaginable evil. When law enforcement finally moved in on a cold, moonless evening, the trailer stood in oppressive silence. The front door, once locked, with careful precision, hung ajar in the cool night air, as if daring investigators to uncover its secrets. Inside, the remnants of David Parker's work bore witness to years of covert cruelty. Faded photographs, torn notebook pages, and the scattered implements of torment. Detectives methodically combed the space, cataloging each piece of evidence with a mixture of professional detachment and grim fascination. Officer Mendez, now a veteran steeped in the sorrow of unsolved cases, stood alone in the twilight of that abandoned trailer. In the stillness, he could almost hear the hushed voices of the lost, the calls of those whose lives had been snuffed out by a man who hid behind the guise of quiet normalcy. The evidence gathered would later link the broken trails of dozens of disappearances to this one hidden chamber of horrors, forever etching David Parker's name in the annals of modern terror. Even as the investigation deepened and the truth began to emerge from the barren New Mexico desert, the lives affected by the cruelty of the toy box killer lingered in the hearts of those who remembered them. Mick Alvarez's family, still searching for answers years later, gathered each anniversary to share memories of a gentle soul who once lit up their world with quiet optimism. Thomas Reed's guitar, discovered among the belongings left behind, was later reunited with friends who recalled his talent and the dreams he had woven into every note. And Sam Collins, whose near-miss encounter had come to define her existence, found solace in writing, a means of transmuting her pain into stories that both honored her own resilience and mourned the irrevocable loss of so many lives. In community centers and support groups across New Mexico, the survivors and families of the missing came together in quiet vigils. They shared anecdotes of the simple routines that once defined their days. Mornings filled with the aroma of coffee, afternoons at local diners, and evenings spent in hopeful conversation. The stark contrast between normalcy and the unspeakable evils that had intruded upon it became a bittersweet refrain, a reminder that darkness often hides in the most unsuspecting corners of life. Despite the successful gathering of evidence, a part of the mystery remained unsolved, a lingering question that haunted both law enforcement and the families of the victims. The full extent of David Parker's crimes, shrouded in secrecy and obscured by his own deliberate evasion, might never be fully known. What was certain, however, was that the toy box in his trailer was not merely a collection of modified tools and twisted devices. It was a symbol of the unfathomable depths of darkness that can lie dormant beneath a seemingly ordinary life. In quiet conversation at neighborhood barbecues, or in hushed tones at memorials, the story of the toy box killer was passed down as a reminder that behind every routine, every familiar face, there might hide a secret far more monstrous than anyone dares to imagine. And in that collective remembrance, there was both sorrow and an unyielding determination, a promise that the lost would be honored, and that the darkness would ultimately be met by the light of human resilience.